It's too dangerous, and I'm not going to risk my children and grandchildren. You really cannot enter this subject if you're serious about having a future at all. We have had very specific contact experience with different types of species and different appearances, heights, shapes, the whole bit. It's like someone being stabbed on the street of New York and everyone watching, and no one wants to intervene. Everyone knew it was not a suicide.
I was just curious, is there a particular ET civilization that's kind of identified themselves to your contact group? I was thinking in terms of like the Phoenix Lights. I know my understanding is that they've attributed that to the Yael civilization. So I was just curious if there was a particular civilization that's kind of communicated or identified themselves.
She's asking if there's a particular ET civilization that's identified itself to our group. The answer is not one particular, but a number of different species. And our purpose of our group is interstellar diplomacy and bringing all of them together. See, so what we would want to avoid is a unilateral, but a bilateral or bipolar cosmos. And you want it to be multilateral, and you want it to be all civilizations, if they're capable of reaching this planet and in fact are here, or near it, or in our solar system, or have that capability, we would want to have humans who are on a team, who are interested in dialogue, peace, and what I call universal peace. I mean, world peace is like the treaty of, the League of Nations. Is way too late for just world peace. We have to go, unfortunately, straight to universal peace. Because it doesn't do any good if you have world peace, but the world is united against fighting one or more ET civilizations. That's not going forward. That's going to oblivion. So Hollywood notwithstanding, and the latest Tom Cruise movie notwithstanding, you really cannot enter this subject if you're serious about having a future at all, without having a multilateral approach. And so we have had very specific contact experience with different types of species and what have you. But my view is that over the years, it's many different ones. Different appearances, heights, shapes, the whole bit. Even in some of the photographs we have. But the point I make to people is that doesn't really matter. That's the external appearance. It's the fact that they're all conscious, sentient, and that what we want to move to is a time of universal peace that involves all these civilizations. Because you cannot go into, if we're going to leave the sort of the last era behind, the era of division and fighting and warfare, which has been the primary organizing principle of this planet for the last few thousand years, both financially and institutionally, has been war. It still is. It's still the biggest industry. It's trillions. If you're going to move past that, and certainly if you're going to move into space, you have to move into it with a new consciousness. As Einstein said, no problem's ever been solved by the consciousness that created it. And so the consciousness of us versus them and picking and choosing and this and that. So from the very beginning, what I found is that we were having experiences with very different types of civilizations and species. All shapes, sizes, everything. And it's really beautiful. And I think that's by design. The philosophy or the ethical underpinning of what we're doing is based on doing exactly that. So, yes, sir.
I'm curious, I pay close attention to the website and pay attention to the money raised for the project related to energy development.
Right.
And I've noticed it's sort of remained at $241K for a while.
That's right. It's pretty much after the release, it kind of just stayed there.
So, you talk a lot about some very high-level connections, both in the military and wealth-wise as well. And I'm just curious as to what is the real obstacle from utilizing those to get to. When we're talking about free energy, $6 million is really not that much money.
I agree with you. Yeah, he's asking the question, with the numbers of people who have been interested and looked into these issues, why hasn't the amount been raised to create this sort of initial to your lab research project? And you have to ask those people. I know them. I can tell you what they've told me. The people who are associated with governments and contracting, they don't want to touch it because they're afraid. There are some high net worth people I've approached, and I'll just give you one example. I can give you this example. You know, my wife knew the gory details of this, and so did my whole group. And this is somebody who lived in Virginia, not far from me, but whose family are industrialists, and they had about a $750 million a year income, and 5 private jets, and actually I'd used them some of these planes to go to some sensitive meetings. And so I approached the scion, the elder of this family, really controlled the operation, and I explained to him how we're running out of time to get this dealt with, and would he do this and help? Because basically the amount of money he blows out of the tail of his Gulfstream jet would do it. And he said, well, I'll tell you why. It's too dangerous, and I'm not going to risk my children and grandchildren who fly around on my planes to do this. I said, well, if I'm doing it, why are you at risk? And he told me a very interesting story that back in the late 1960s, he knew an executive with General Motors who was telling him about the 0-point type energy systems they had in some of the classified research at General Motors, and that he felt it was time for that to come out so that every car coming off the assembly line was basically an electric free energy car. It didn't have to be plugged in. I mean, way past a Tesla. And this is, I think, in '68. And he said that 2 weeks later, after he was openly talking about this executive was found dead. And it looked like a suicide. But this industrialist that I knew very well told me that everyone knew it was not a suicide. And so I found that, the fear is the mind killer. So, there are a lot of people who know about this, but they don't want to stick their necks out. The public, by and large, just wants to be entertained by it. I would say that if, you can launch an app of, kitty cats playing pianos and probably pull in $10 million in a month or something. What is it, Candy Crush, or some of these idiotic apps and video games. But I have not found that the public is always, no offense, doing what you're doing. And that is, why doesn't someone else fund this? So it's a little like the little red hen phenomenon, where the little red hen everyone wants to eat the cake or bread, but no one wants to help cook it. And so everyone's looking for someone else to do it. It's like someone being stabbed on the street of New York and everyone watching, and no one wants to intervene. Because the people who are high enough in industry and finance know that you're stepping on some big toes if you move into this. And the masses, for the most part, mainly want to be entertained by this subject. It's just sort of a fascinating conspiracy theory sort of thing. And so, so that's been the problem. The masses haven't put in the funds as sort of the movie was crowdfunded, but moving that from a few 100,000 to a few million didn't happen. And then the very wealthy people, for the most part, are really afraid of touching this third rail. Boom, zap. But if you know someone who's got the courage, it's all about courage. And whether it's going out and making contact, or having the courage to explore your own capabilities and consciousness, or doing this, it's all about the courage we manifest. And a lot of times you find that people who are quite wealthy and comfortable do not want to step into something where they could be greatly in harm's way. And so that fear creates its own containment. Now, my own view of it is that I think it's an unfounded fear. I'm not saying there's zero risk. I just think that it's mostly psychological at this point. Besides, I tell people I'm the canary in the mine shaft. So as long as I'm still twittering away, you shouldn't have too much to worry about. But there have been a number of people, a few dozen, when I say a few dozen people who have net worths north of hundreds of millions to billions, that I've met with, but they do not want to step into this. And what would be easier is to find probably 10 or 12 people of more moderate worth who would each put in 500,000 or something. But that hasn't happened either. So we'll see. I mean, all I say is that, you know, when there's a critical mass of awareness, and I keep doing everything I can as a single individual, then it'll happen. And if not, then it won't happen, and we'll get the consequences of that. And then it'll happen in the aftermath. At the phoenix, I call it the phoenix, picking all up from the ashes. So it's not there's no question in my mind it will happen at some point, but will it be soon enough? And can we avoid a lot of huge problems? I mean, imagine if we had not needed Mideast oil 50, 60, 70 years ago, where we would not have had the hegemony and the presence in the Middle East that have led to the mess we're in now. Never mind the biosphere being damaged and the pollution and cancer rates skyrocketing. But, you know, again, there was a fear of taking on the macroeconomic status quo. And the macroeconomic status quo, I mean, it's like when the Minister of Defense of Canada, Paul Hellyer, and I were talking about this. I was at his home, and he says that he was a macroeconomic person to start with. And he said, basically, that's the big problem, is that this is not something that's just like creating another computer system, or it's bringing out a whole paradigm of science technology that would change the entire petrodollar system and the whole macroeconomic order, and with it, the commodities markets and hundreds of trillions of dollars of wealth that somebody owns that's sitting in the ground in the form of uranium and oil and coal and what have you, plus all the generating capacity that goes with it. So it's such a huge change that most people don't want to entertain doing it. And I've talked to people at Goldman Sachs about this, and they said, oh yeah, you're talking about basically wiping out $600 trillion in assets. So, trillion. So, you know, and the whole US federal government, including Social Security and all the entitlements, is $3.5 trillion. So this is, the longer we put it off, the more the world is dependent on the old paradigm and the more it cannibalizes and destroys itself. However, and it becomes more and more difficult to do it. So it's kind of like putting off repairing a leak in your roof of your house. You can put it off, and eventually the damn thing's going to cave in on your head. But all I can do, you know, I don't have the resources to do it, and is articulate what could be done, hope there's some people who gather around the vision, and we get it done in enough time. You know, you have to understand, when I started this in my, I guess I was in my mid-30s in 1990 when I started all this, and I thought, well, if I put the information together and provided it on a silver platter tied up in a bow to the right people, they do the right thing. Wrong. So I got disabused of that notion very quickly. But, you know, so ultimately that's why we then said, well, disclosure of this information, the contact effort, I never viewed the government doing that initially. I always saw that as a citizen's diplomacy. But then also the technology, I realized, would have to be coming from we the people. So it's about organizing we the people. And so I tell everyone who's listening to this, share this information with the right people in your network, send them to our site, and through networking, maybe the right folks will line up who have the courage to step forward and make it a reality. Or somebody with one of these technologies who has one that's already operational will step forward and be willing to do something strategically sane. Because the strategically insane thing to do is to do what Stan Meyer did and Rossi is doing and almost every other inventor I know had done, which resulted in a catastrophe. So all I can do is encourage, and you know, but I do think, you know, it's all networking. You know, it's like networking it out there. The way that we've reached the people we've reached is through networking.
So when you were talking about the suppression of this knowledge, I guess my question to you is, do you subscribe to any kind of idea like Illuminati, curtailing this, and does any type of negative kind of ET presence fit into that model, where it's kind of been keeping it like a prison planet type of idea?
Well, the question is in terms of the information being kept secret, is there some Illuminati type entity, or perhaps even ET presence keeping it secret? I doubt it in the way that it's the mythology, the internet mythology would say it is. I think it has more to do with the fact that there are, let's say, called cartels, interest groups that are also competing interest groups, human, not ET, that don't want certain aspects of this out. And there are points where they cooperate and there are points where they don't. Now there's something, the latest iteration of it, I've been told from some of my intelligence sources, is called SIG, S-I-G, which is the Senior Interagency Intelligence Group. And the SIG, which, from the old Majesty and Majestic entity from the Truman era, and on some of the documents I have, it says MAGIC, M-A-J-I-C, classification. Those are, intelligence groups that operate out of normal chain of command. They work with people in different countries. And then they will usually have representation from different interest groups, such as religious, technological, financial, macroeconomic, et cetera, and so on. And so there's really a simplistic view that there's sort of like one group. It's the Bilderbergers, it's the Illuminati, it's the this. It was interesting because a few years ago I was at a meeting in San Francisco, and it was after the Disclosure Project was launched. And Henry Dakin, who the Dakin Toy Company, was hosting sort of a reception at his loft in San Francisco. And Judith Scutch was there, who was the original publisher of the Course in Miracles with Marianne Will, and very big supporter, and her husband was a colonel. And she was friends with this man who had just been up at the Bohemian Grove, with the whole Bohemian Grove. It was like 2,500 people. And this issue came up. And the issue of, it was a very wealthy European financier. And so this issue came up about disclosure, because they'd all been in the news. And they had someone there to get up on the stage and tell everyone that they were part of a very high governmental scientific entity that had looked into this, that none of it was true, that it was all just misinterpretations and swamp gas and Venus rising or whatever, the usual blather. And all those 2,500 people took it to heart and believed it because it was their peerage. So I want to talk about peer-to-peer containment systems. So you have one group of peerage, it's called the U.S. Senate. Out of those 100 guys, 1 or 2 people are read into or know about this subject. Their task is to lie to the other 99 or 98. Bilderbergers, there might be a handful of them, they lie to the rest. Bohemian Grove, same thing. So people have this very simplistic view of how secrecy like this would be maintained, and that there's some sort of vast sort of conspiracy and there'd be all these people. Because of compartmentalization, there would be people, and compartmentalization is where you have a very walled off area of operation where it's compartmented to that particular task or research, and it is so narrowly focused, and the people in there have such blind, they don't know what the person in the next cubicle's doing, never mind what the big picture is. So it's very easy when you have extreme compartmentalization to keep most people in the dark about what's really going on. And then there'll be a handful of people who really know. And they may, this committee, if you want to look at it that way, this intelligence group might have 200 or 300 people from different countries who are themselves members of different elite groups. And those folks would then lie to their brethren in that peerage to deceive them. And that's their job. And they're trained professionally to lie. So it isn't as if I would say 99.99999% of everything I've ever seen that's out there on this trash dump called the internet has almost no bearing in reality, because it's just too imbecilic. It would not be operating that way. Now, for special compartment, top secret, TSSCI, top secret special compartment intelligence to operate, is the compartment part. It's not the top secret part. There are 980,000 people in the United States with top secret clearances, which means they're common as dirt. It's the compartment you're in, all right? So you may have Q clearance, which used to be the clearance for nuclear weapons and stuff. But it doesn't mean that just because you have Q clearance, you have clearance into electromagnetogravitics. In fact, you almost certainly would not. So, and the same thing goes in for corporate. Same thing goes for, it was interesting, I was in San Francisco at another time, and there was a woman who lived in Pacific Heights, the end of Broadway, where all the $100 million mansions, the Getty home and Larry Ellison, all these people live. And she was hosting her neighbors for a salon. And I was the guest for this dinner party. And, there were all these people. And the guy on one side of me had been the chairman of SRI, Stanford Research International. And they had had contracts dealing with this issue. But he said, I was only the chairman of SRI, so I didn't have a need to know what was really going on. So because I've never been in the government, but I have all these hundreds of people who provided information from all these different walks of life over the last 50 years in terms of experience, people going all the way back to the 50s, 60 years, that I've become sort of a source for that. So he was picking my brain. Here was the chairman of SRI. And then across the table was the chairman of AT&T. Now, AT&T has had a lot of contracts with the intelligence community dealing with this issue. But the chairman of AT&T didn't know about it because he was only the chairman of AT&T. He was not read into. So it's compartmented at corporate, governmental, political, and religious levels. It's not so simple that there would be some one entity you can name and then, sort of vent your spleen. That group is. Now, the question of whether there are interstellar civilizations that are cooperating or facilitating that, I'm very skeptical of. But it could be theoretically possible that in the early days, they were hoping that there would be some kind of rapprochement with leaders, military or political, and have had contact. An ongoing level of that is less likely, but if it is happening, then we need a CE5 effort even more. Here's what I always say to people. Let's say that there are, they say now, 11 billion star systems in the Milky Way that have Earth-like planets around them. And the Milky Way is only one of billions of galaxies. The likelihood is that there are countless numbers of civilizations out there. And you can't prove a negative. I can't say everyone is at a state of enlightenment. I will say that if they become interstellar and they haven't blown themselves up yet, they're more evolved than we are. However, it could be that there are some that have interests and ethical concerns that don't comport with contemporary human ones. But that's where you would need to have even more of a diplomatic communicative effort. And the worst thing you can do is relegate that to people in covert military operations, because they're only looking at the universe with rose-colored military glasses on. And it's all about power and control. And so, it's sort of like, when there used to be a U.S. Senator from Virginia named John Warner, not the current Mark Warner, no relation. And he had been chairman of armed services and intel, various things. And I knew he was involved with Majesty and Magic. And he had been one of the secretaries of the Navy way back, I believe, or undersecretary of the Navy. And one of his, a member of my team who had dated him for a while, went out at his place in Virginia, met with him, and brought this whole issue up. And he basically listened to her and said nothing, stone-faced. And where she left off the previous conversation to that exact word, he picked it up and continued, and just that issue was just sequestered out. He would not acknowledge it at all. And one of my military advisors had the same experience with Admiral Harry Train, who did the exact same thing when it was brought up, though, except he also said, I am profoundly disinterested in discussing this issue with you, and dropped it. Okay, and that was the same admiral who was at Atlantic Command when we went to full code zebra because of these craft off the coast of eastern coast of the United States. So I think that, you know, they're very, very disciplined about that. And I've met with a number of these sort of characters. And yet you have other people like Senator Claiborne Pell, who the Pell Grants, anyone who was really poor like I was who got a Pell Grant to go to college. I was at a dinner party with him. In fact, my wife and I were there, and for Noetic Sciences Institute. And after the dinner party, we went out on the patio of this beautiful home in San Rafael near George Lucas's place, right next to the Skywalker Ranch. And we were there, and Senator Pell and I were talking, and he just sort of epitomized noblesse oblige, and was this wonderful guy, very, very genuine, crossed the aisle, tried to do great things for the country, patrician, very great. And we were talking, and you know, and he turned to me, he says, well, Dr. Greer, would you come and brief my staff on this? And I said, well, sure, anytime you want me to. He says, because we've asked about this and no one's ever told us anything. And he'd been on every committee. And I was looking at him, and I looked up at the stars, and I looked at him, and I said, you know, you've been deprived of dealing with the ultimate foreign relations issue, and you're the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. And I pointed to the stars above my head, and he looked at me through those, you know, horn-rimmed glasses and blinked. He says, well, Dr. Greer, I'm afraid you might be right. I said, well, I am. And it was really a poignant, but really innocent, funny, but sad moment. That here's this guy, you know, had been in Congress or the Senate since the 50s, then been denied any information on this, who would have been a great interstellar diplomat. And instead, the wise, the enlightened, the peace-loving people who should have been handling this got shoved to the side, relegated to the scrap heap of history. And the warmongers and the control freaks and the misanthropic money whores, I have a few other adjectives I'll leave off, kind of took it over, which is what happened. As Eisenhower famously said, beware the military-industrial complex. He was specifically talking about the fact he lost control over this and other issues in 1956 when Nelson Rockefeller, the Rockefeller Commission, Lawrence's brother, Nelson Rockefeller reorganized the Department of Defense and CIA under the Rockefeller Commission in 1956. So no president since 1956 has had, even if they've known about the issue, they have not had operational control over these projects. So it's been an unconstitutional, off the rails for the last almost 60 years.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out the next one right here on the Best of Dr. Stephen Greer.